right, in this lesson, we're going to take a look at the specifics of blood pressure control. So before we get into the ins and outs of it, we need to look at a couple of different concepts and a couple of different formulas. The first concept is the actual idea of blood pressure. And what we're looking at is we're looking on the force of contraction and that force measured against the aorta. And it happens in two phases. Well, the first part is during ventricular systole. So this is during the contraction of the ventricles. And this normal measurement is going to be less than 120 millimeters of mercury. Now, when the ventricles relax, this is ventricular diastole, and it's going to be less than 80. And so this is what blood pressure is actually measuring. We also look at another concept called pulse pressure. And what pulse pressure is it's the difference between the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure, and that gives us our pulse pressure. So if we look at 120 minus 80, that's going to be 40. Now, there's two concepts when we're looking at pulse pressure. The first one is a widened pulse pressure or a narrowed pulse pressure. And what this indicates is it indicates the strength of the heart. So a widened pulse pressure, meaning that the pulse pressure is actually going to go up. So we'll use the example of like 160. Let's say the blood pressure is 160 over 80. What we're looking at is 160 minus 80. That gives us a pulse pressure of 80 millimeters of mercury. This is a widened pulse pressure. So basically, there's a lot of force that the heart has to beat against to get the blood out, but then it can completely relax to normal. And that tells us that the heart is strong. Now, let's imagine that the pulse pressure is narrowed. So let's take the 160 and let's say it's like up to 130. Well, that's going to give us a pulse pressure of 30 millimeters of mercury, and that is a decrease or a narrowed pulse pressure, and that tells us the heart is weakened. So there's just a lot of force, a lot of resistance that the heart's having to beat against, and it's telling us that the heart is weakened. Now there's this other concept that we need to look at, which is called mean arterial pressure, and it's the average pressure of those arteries during every cardiac cycle. And this is the formula that we use to get our MAP, which is you measure 2 times the diastolic pressure, and then you add the systolic pressure, and you divide that whole concept or that whole number by 3. So let's use our 120 over 80. Well, so 2 times the diastolic pressure, so 2 times 80, that equals 160. And then we're going to add the 120. That gives us 280, and we're going to divide that by 3, and that gives us 93.3. This is a normal MAP, or mean arterial pressure. And the reason we need to know about MAP is because at the level of the capillaries, there has to be this exchange of waste and nutrients and gases. Well, this MAP helps us to understand how well it's happening. So the closer we get to normal, the better you're going to have this force of exchange in those capillaries to get the waste and nutrients in, or the waste out and the nutrients in, and have that exchange of those gases. Now let's take a look at the regulation of MAP and how it works. So when we're calculating MAP, we need to look at 2 concepts. Well, you have this concept of cardiac output, and then you have the concept of peripheral resistance. And we're going to go over the peripheral resistance here in a second, but that's what that calculation is. There's a great lesson on cardiac physiology, which talks about cardiac output and how to get that number. So I encourage you to check that lesson out. But when we're talking about peripheral resistance, this is the resistance out further away in the body. So like think arms, legs, that kind of stuff. And there are some influencing factors. So first is viscosity of blood. So how thick is the blood? And there are a couple of things that can influence this. And first one is like if there's an increase in the red blood cell production, that's going to increase the viscosity and make it thicker. Also, if there's dehydration, this is decreased water in the blood, and that's going to also increase this thickness. If there's an increased pressure or increased peripheral resistance, that's going to, or like smaller diameter vessels, because of some sort of maybe a sympathetic response, that's going to increase that peripheral resistance as well. Now, the central nervous system has a huge influence on blood control, or blood pressure control. There are basically 2 centers we look at, and the first one is vasomotor center, and the second one is the cardiac center. And the vasomotor center is located in the medulla, and there is going to be a constant sympathetic output to the smooth muscle, and this is going to create a steady contraction on the blood vessels, and it's going to create the vasomotor tone. And there are going to be some things that influence tone. If the blood vessels dilate, that means that there's a decreased output from the vasomotor center, and that's going to decrease the pressure resistance in those vessels. If there's vasoconstriction, that means that there's an increased output from the vasomotor center, and that's going to increase the pressure resistance. So that's where the blood vessels are getting smaller, so they're constricting down. If you have, now in the cardiac center, there are going to be two specific centers that we look at. One is called the cardioacceleratory center, and that's going to influence sympathetic output. And then there's also something called the cardioinhibitory center, and that's going to influence parasympathetic output. And I like to think about it like this. If we want to accelerate and go faster, what does that? Well, norepinephrine is going to do that. And if we want to, that's going to be your sympathetic output, so your fight or flight response. And then also, if we want to slow things down, this is where you're going to need to get your acetylcholine, and that's going to be your parasympathetic output. We also have some receptors in our body that help to influence blood pressure control. And the two that we're going to look at are called baroreceptors and chemoreceptors. Now, baroreceptors are receptors in our blood or in our circulatory system that sense changes in blood pressure. And you have two locations typically for these, and you have the vagus nerve, which is located at the aortic arch. And then you have in the carotid sinus, you have the glossopharyngeal nerve, which has baroreceptors as well. If there's a decrease in blood pressure, what happens is there's a sympathetic impulse that's sent to those arterioles, and that's going to increase the norepinephrine. It's going to cause a vasoconstriction, and the peripheral resistance is going to go up, and it's going to increase blood pressure. Now, if you have let's say you have an increase in blood pressure, what happens is this sympathetic impulse slows down. So you're going to have less norepinephrine that gets released, and you're going to have subsequently, you're going to have vasodilation. So it's going to decrease the peripheral resistance, and it's going to decrease the blood pressure. Now, with your chemoreceptors, they sense chemical changes. So they look at things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and even pH. And the two locations for these are the vagus nerve, and that's going to be in the aortic arch. And then you have the glossopharyngeal nerve near the, and that's going to be innervated in the internal carotid artery. And what happens is, as this senses, let's say there's a decrease in oxygen, what happens is there's going to be an increase in the sympathetic output, and that's going to increase that norepinephrine at the arterioles. And what happens is, because of this vasoconstriction that happens, it's going to increase the blood flow through the lungs and increase in oxygenation because that peripheral resistance goes up. So the body's response is, hey, we need more oxygen. So we're going to tighten everything down. We're going to get more heart activity, and we're going to get the blood pumping. We're going to try to pick up more oxygen as it passes through the lungs in order to compensate. So what happens if like the opposite occurs? So let's say the blood pressure drops. Well, you're going to have those impulses that are sent to the cardiac centers. Specifically in the cardioacceleratory center, you're going to get increased sympathetic output at that SA node. So we're going to increase the norepinephrine here, and that's going to increase that heart rate. And at the same time, in the cardioinhibitory center, the acetylcholine response is going down. So we're going to get less acetylcholine input at that SA node. And it's going to increase the heart rate because we're trying to increase that cardiac output. We're going to want to try to increase our mean arterial pressure because basically our blood pressure is dropping. We need to compensate somehow. What about the cardiac chemoreflex? Well, these chemoreceptors are here to detect those changes like we talked about. Well, if there's a decrease in that oxygen in the cardioacceleratory center, you're going to get this increased sympathetic output of norepinephrine at the SA node. We're going to get a decreased parasympathetic output at the SA node. So we're going to try to increase the heart rate because we want to increase cardiac output. So we have to do that by basically stimulating the sympathetic output. And what's going to happen is you're going to get this increased rate of depolarization. So it's going to increase that heart rate and cardiac output. And it's also going to increase your mean arterial pressure. And what's going to happen is you're going to get this is going to be your increased blood flow through the body. So, hey, our oxygen's low. So what's going to happen is we need to increase our heart rate. And so it's not uncommon to see people that have low levels, or let's say there's suddenly a low level of oxygen. What happens is the body has to compensate, and it basically increases the heart rate because it says, hey, we need to get more, get the blood to the lungs to pick up more oxygen more quickly. The thing I want you to realize is that blood pressure has a lot of influences, and sometimes these systems can work together, and then sometimes they work in unison, sometimes they work synergistically, and they can work at different times. So what you need to realize is that there are two centers which kind of base this idea, and you have the vasomotor center, and then you have the cardiac center. Vasomotor center is responsible for that sympathetic only output. And then the cardiac centers are going to be responsible for both sympathetic and parasympathetic. Just know that, just realize that there's more than one input when it comes to blood pressure, and that can help influence how our body responds. Okay, so let's recap. The first thing you need to look at is that baroreceptors sense the blood pressure changes in the system, and then you have chemoreceptors, which are responsible for sensing the chemical changes. And these things, these are the things that are going to tell our brain how our body needs to compensate. You have two centers. You have the vasomotor center, and then you have the cardiac center. Your vasomotor center is going to be responsible for the sympathetic response only, whereas your cardiac center has your sympathetic and your parasympathetic responses. Remember that norepinephrine is a sympathetic response, so we want to increase heart rate, increase cardiac output. That's the center, or the neurotransmitter that's going to do that. And then your acetylcholine is going to be your parasympathetic response, and that's going to decrease your heart rate and decrease your cardiac output, and therefore decrease your blood pressure. That's it for our lesson on blood pressure control. Make sure you check out all the resources attached to this lesson. Now go out and be your best selves today, and as always, happy nursing.